He would walk straight up to a 4-metre saltwater crocodile, one of the last animals on Earth that still hunts human beings for food. Plant his bare feet in the mud and grin like he'd just met an old friend. No cage, no weapon. Just khaki shorts, a head full of blonde hair, and a kind of fearlessness that didn't look quite human. To 1 billion people around the world, he was a single word, shouted with pure joy. Crikey! He was the Crocodile Hunter, and for one extraordinary decade, Steve Irwin made the entire planet fall in love with the creatures it had been taught to fear. But the boy who became that legend didn't come from a film studio or a television network. He came from a tiny reptile park on the side of an Australian road. And the way his story ends, on an ordinary morning, in calm, shallow water, is something almost nobody saw coming. This is the life of Steve Irwin. Stephen Robert Irwin was born on the 22nd of February, 1962, near Melbourne. But his real childhood didn't begin until his family packed up and moved north to Queensland, chasing a dream most people would have called madness. His father, Bob, was a plumber with an obsession for reptiles. His mother, Lynn, had a gift for healing injured animals. Together, in 1970, they opened a small roadside collection of snakes and lizards and ran it by hand. And so Steve grew up somewhere no other child did. His back garden was full of crocodiles. His playmates had scales and fangs. For his 6th birthday, while other children were getting bicycles, Steve was given a python longer than he was tall. By the age of 9, his father was teaching him to slip into dark rivers at night and catch crocodiles with his bare hands. It sounds reckless, and it was. But Bob was teaching his son one lesson above all others, that these animals weren't monsters to be killed. They were creatures to be understood and protected. Steve didn't just learn that lesson, he absorbed it into his bones. By the time he was a young man, Steve had become something rare. One of the most skilled crocodile handlers in all of Australia. He volunteered for a government crocodile relocation program, a job that meant living alone in the bush for months at a time, in brutal heat, capturing dangerous crocodiles that would otherwise have been shot. Think about that while the rest of the world slept. Steve Irwin was out in the dark, wrestling enormous, prehistoric predators out of the water. Not for fame, not for cameras, but to save their lives. He'd move them somewhere safe, then vanish back into the wilderness to do it all again. For years, almost nobody knew his name. He was just a wild, sunburnt young man with an impossible gift, doing dangerous, lonely, unglamorous work because he believed it mattered. And then, one day in 1991, an American tourist walked into his family's zoo, and everything changed. Her name was Terri. She was from Oregon in the United States, and she ran a wildlife rehabilitation center of her own. She'd come to Australia hoping to meet a crocodile conservationist she could admire. What she found was Steve, mid-demonstration, and she later said she fell for him almost on the spot. Here was a man whose passion for animals burned exactly as brightly as her own. They were married just 8 months later, in 1992. And here is where the legend truly begins. For their honeymoon, Steve and Terri didn't go to a beach. They went crocodile catching, and they brought a camera along to film it. That honeymoon footage of Steve leaping onto wild crocodiles with his new wife filming beside him became the very first episode of a television series. They called it The Crocodile Hunter. Neither of them had the faintest idea what they had just set in motion. The Crocodile Hunter first aired in Australia in 1996. Then it crossed the ocean onto a young network called Animal Planet, and it detonated. Because the world had never seen anything like Steve Irwin. Wildlife documentaries were supposed to be calm, hushed, a quiet voice over slow footage. Steve tore that rulebook to pieces. He sprinted toward danger. He shouted. He pushed his face right up to the camera, eyes wide, and bellowed. "Crikey, will you look at this beauty," with the unfiltered joy of a child. He wore the same outfit every single day, khaki shirt, khaki shorts. Until that uniform became one of the most recognizable looks on the planet. But the real secret to why people loved him wasn't the danger. It was that none of it was an act. Steve's enthusiasm was completely, impossibly genuine. When he told you an animal was beautiful, you believed him. Because he so obviously, desperately meant it. Within a few years, his show was reaching an estimated 500 million people in over 100 countries. A barefoot kid from a roadside reptile park had become a global superstar. But Steve never forgot what the fame was actually for. He took his parents' little reptile park and transformed it into Australia Zoo, one of the most respected wildlife facilities in the world. He poured his money into conservation, buying up vast stretches of land purely to protect the animals living on them. He founded an organization called Wildlife Warriors. To Steve, every single fan he made was another soldier in a war to save the natural world. He wasn't without controversy. In 2004, he was fiercely criticized. After he held his baby son in one arm while feeding a crocodile with the other. Steve insisted the child was never in danger, that he was in complete control. But the backlash was intense, and it cut him deeply. Because the criticism missed who he really was. The showmanship, the stunts, the shouting, all of it served one single, burning purpose. Steve Irwin truly believed that if he could just make you love a crocodile, you might help him save one. Away from the cameras, Steve was, above everything else, a father. In 1998, he and Terri had a daughter, Bindi, named after one of his favorite crocodiles. In 2003, they had a son, Robert. Steve adored them completely. And he dreamed of the day they would carry on his work. He filmed alongside Bindi. He carried little Robert into the bush as a toddler, exactly as his own father had once carried him. The cycle was repeating, the love of wild things passing down from one generation to the next, just as it had once passed to him. He was at the absolute peak of his life, beloved around the world, surrounded by a family he treasured beyond measure. And then came the 4th of September, 2006. Steve was off the coast of Queensland, filming in the clear, shallow waters of the Great Barrier Reef. The weather had turned poor for his main project, so he decided to shoot some gentle footage for a different program, a documentary about ocean life. In the water with him was a stingray, a normally placid creature resting on the sea floor. Steve swam above it for the camera. And then, in a sudden, freak moment that nobody could have anticipated, the stingray reacted. Its barbed tail striking upward, piercing his chest and stopping his heart. It happened in seconds. The man who had survived thousands of encounters with the deadliest animals on Earth was gone at just 44 years old from one of the most unlikely accidents imaginable. The news swept across the world within hours, and the grief that followed was extraordinary. People who had never met him wept openly, tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Australia mourned a national hero. Because Steve Irwin had never been just a television presenter. He had been a source of pure, infectious joy, and the world felt suddenly, painfully quieter without him. But here is the part of the story Steve would have wanted you to hear the most. It didn't end. His daughter Bindi grew up to become a wildlife conservationist and presenter in her own right, carrying her father's message with the same bright, fearless warmth. His son Robert became a celebrated wildlife photographer, and the spitting image of the man who raised him, right down to the khaki. And Terri has kept Australia's zoo and the whole conservation mission alive and thriving, year after year. The crocodiles he fought to protect are still protected, the land he bought is still wild, and the millions of children who once watched him, wide-eyed, grew up caring about animals. Because he taught them how. Steve Irwin spent his entire life trying to make the world fall in love with the creatures it feared. And against every expectation, a barefoot boy from a tiny reptile park on the side of an Australian road did exactly that. Crikey, what a life!